Right. So, continuing on, lesson 9, we're moving. We've already talked about the North African campaign and the turning point of the North African campaign, victory at El Alamein, and the U.S. British combined Allied Operation what? Yeah, good. Operation Torch. Well done. So now the Allies are setting their sights on Mediterranean invasion of Italy. We left off talking about the fact that America is not into this, especially George C. Marshall and FDR, but Churchill believes that Italy is the soft underbelly of Europe, and that this particular attack will open up the door for a larger cross-channel invasion. It does not work out quite that way, but there is a significant success that comes out of the Italian campaign. So we're going to deal with that by the time we're done today. So what we're looking at is the invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky, and the Italian campaign. So this was launched on July 10th, 1943. It's a joint Allied invasion. Again, George C. Marshall is not too keen on this particular invasion, nor are other American commanders like Eisenhower. The fighting was very difficult. Even though the Italians put up a weak defense, the Germans were dug in and ready to go, and this took just over a month to take Sicily. Ernie Pyle, who was a war correspondent from Scripps and Howard, Martha Gellhorn, a correspondent for Collier's. Are y'all familiar with Martha Gellhorn? Hemingway's third wife. They just recently, a few years back, did a movie on Hemingway and Gellhorn. John Steinbeck wrote for different publications. Remember when we went to the War Memorial, they talked about Stars and Stripes and Yank and some of these other magazines, all types of magazines, Life, a number of different, like I said, even Collier's. They're covering the war, so they're war correspondents throughout. Do you remember anybody read any of Steinbeck's work?
Yeah.
Very good. Mice and Men. Excellent. Right? So these are just 3 of hundreds of correspondents throughout. And keep in mind, correspondents are anywhere from writers to sketch artists to journalists, filmmakers. We're going to be talking about filmmakers in the war in our next lesson. Italians put up weak resistance, but as I said, the Germans, under the leadership of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, fought hard. In fact, he gained command of the entire Italian campaign. You remember where we talked about Kesselring before? He was like a high-ranking field marshal with the Luftwaffe, and then he took the southern command in Operation Barbarossa, and he's going to be moved into this command to hold these defensive lines in Italy. Patton, commander of the Western Task Force, and Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 8th Army, are going to race toward Palermo and Messina. I think Eric you're reviewing Patton, so have you started watching it yet? Okay, so they capture that sort of rivalry between Patton and Montgomery. It's very real. This sort of who's going to get there first, who's going to win. Patton is going to face a political or sort of a public relations nightmare when visiting an Italian hospital for American soldiers. He went in, and he's not the only private, Charles Herman Cole. There's another guy as well, but Patton slaps the guy because the guy had battle fatigue, and calls him, yellow belly, and believes that he should be lined up. I think it was more of like it wasn't a yellow belly, it was like, you yellow son of a bitch, I believe is what he said, and slapped him and said, you need to be put up against the wall and shot. And the command, especially Eisenhower, wanted to keep all that under wraps, right? But the story leaked, and Patton is going to ultimately not lose the command, but just be removed. In fact, when he went to give his public apology, his men chanted so loud that he couldn't speak. So again, the film captures that moment. Patton is actually going to be, after the successful invasion of Sicily and the movement onto the mainland Italy, Bloody Boot, this is where Eisenhower and Patton moved to England to start to plan D-Day, and now Harold Alexander will maintain command of Allied forces. So what U.S. commanders hanging around? We've talked about. Very good, Mark Wayne Clark. So the Fifth Army is going to stay intact, and they're going to fight along with Harold Alexander. Interestingly enough, the Fifth Army is actually mostly made up of U.S. soldiers, but it is a bit of a melting pot. They've got some Polish soldiers, Indian soldiers, they've got Canadian soldiers, some British soldiers attached to them as well. So Churchill continues to express the soft underbelly. One of the war correspondents said, Churchill's soft underbelly is pregnant with German veterans, difficult terrain, and horrible mud, rain, and snow. And that was really the big problem with this campaign. These guys were fighting, the rain came in Italy so hard in that year that waterways that were just like, small streams turned into like these flooding rivers, and they're fighting in mud up to their waists, and they're fighting on these steep mountain passes. No army in history had ever taken Italy from the south. So this is against all odds sort of scenario. And we're talking about it taking months just to move 200-300 miles at a time because of the mountain passes being so steep. One of the most, this is the invasion, the successful invasion of Sicily, month-long campaign, or just over a month-long campaign. Sicily is captured. The Germans are going to be able to retreat back and fall into the defensive lines, the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, and the Gothic Line. Two of the most valuable resources in this particular campaign, it's fought well over a year, is going to be pack mules and horses. But typically about 30 or about 70% of the way a pack mule or a horse could go, but the very last ascent on a mountain, all that had to be carried by soldiers. So battle fatigue was a really big problem. Another problem, a big problem, was frostbite. A lot of guys lost toes, fingers, and feet due to the freezing temperatures, because the rains would come as they got into high altitudes. All that mud was frozen, and a lot of these guys had to go all the way back down mountain passes to get to aid stations. And a lot of them, by the time they got there, lost their fingers, toes, sometimes feet. Yeah.
Okay, so if they took a horse like 75% of the way up there, what they do once the horse couldn't go anymore? They just up?
They would unload the horse and then just and have encampments for horses and mules.
Okay, I didn't know if they were just
yeah. In fact, cavalry, horse cavalry became a really big deal in this particular campaign. Can you guys hang in here with me, please? Thanks. All right. So On the left here, we got Ernie Pyle. He is not going to make it through the war. Tragically, he will die in the Pacific in 1945 in the last fixed battle of the war. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He is the most popular journalist that covered the war. He was considered the GI's journalist. He was so popular, in fact, he wrote to Congress that all men in combat should receive bonuses, and they called it the Ernie Pyle Bill, because the pilots, the fighter pilots, they got bonuses. Well, because of Ernie Pyle, combat infantrymen received bonuses for what we would call now, what do we call that?
Combat.
Yeah, combat pay. That's Ernie Pyle pushed forth combat pay. On the top right there, there's Martha Gellhorn. She was a war correspondent in Italy. She had also been a correspondent with Hemingway in what event prior to the war? Very good, Spanish Civil War. And then here we have on the bottom right, John Steinbeck. Steinbeck did a really incredible job of writing about the soldier fatigue, because he himself was like losing his mind and cracking up. And because these folks, they're not like behind enemy lines, or I'm sorry, they're not behind the rear echelon, they're in combat. Yeah, they're journalists in combat. They were in. Sometimes the journalists did, but almost always the filmmakers, they just had their cameras, and like we're going to talk about Norman Hatch, like he filmed some of the most important footage in the Pacific at Tarawa, and won an Academy Award for it. In fact, he filmed himself and another Marine basically taking a Japanese pillbox or a bunker. It's a bunker. So let's talk about the mainland invasion. So Mussolini's out of power, but he's actually installed into a puppet government backed by Hitler in northern Italy. This was really a sad moment in history for any Italian partisan or any Italian Jew. Hitler had any partisan that was captured or any Italian Jew that was captured rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. Hitler took this as a sign, because of Mussolini falling out of power, to send more soldiers in to back Kesselring. One of the most difficult things for the Allies were the combat engineers, the Nazi combat engineers that were brought in. The combat engineers gave Bernard Montgomery the worst time, because they kept bogging him down by blowing up bridges, taking out roads. From September of 43, the invasion of Toronto began. Obviously, Kesselring is going to defend. This is kind of crazy. In Sicily and outside of Toronto, nearly twice the Nazis were almost captured, but they managed to break away. Keep in mind, as they begin to move north, nearly every mountaintop and every mountainside was fortified with German 88s, German machine gun nests, and landmines all over the place. And that was, I think, probably one of the most eloquent correspondence written by Gellhorn, talking about the landmines and how devastating the landmines were for soldiers. Mark Wayne Clark's Fifth Army landed south of Naples at Salerno. This was actually a near failure. He nearly retreated and called in naval support, but they held the line and managed to continue the advance. This is also a really sad chapter that the American correspondents captured. The Nazis from Naples all the way to Rome would go in to cathedrals They would go into libraries. There was a library that that dated, a library in a university that dated back to the 1200s, and they would go in and take kerosene and gasoline, douse it in the entire building, throw hand grenades in every room, and they would do it on a Sunday afternoon. So the fire department would be slow to act, and then they would set up guards to prevent the fire department from putting them out, and they would just burn everything down. Anything they wanted, they sent regiments of Nazis in to steal, like, I guess we could, Indiana Jones, you think about that, or the Monuments Men. Well, that really happened. The Nazis were trying to take artifacts, and anything they didn't want, they just burned, and they burned, like, the amount of history that the Nazis destroyed is absolutely heartbreaking. And again, obviously the loss of human life in this war is devastating, but just to think like how senseless it was to destroy all of this, and they were actually destroying the history and culture of their ally. That made this even more bizarre. Yeah.
Well, I think Syria, there's a big problem with ISIS.
Oh,
destroying,
it's
ancient monuments
yeah.
that are like 5,000 years old.
Oh, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. British soldiers. So at this point, the British and the Allies or U.S. and British and other Allied soldiers are really going to have to fight on in Italy all the way to 1945. Even though Rome falls in 44, the fighting continues in Italy all the way into northern Italy. Again, some of the hardest fighting of the entire war. There's a guy I wanted to bring up, and he's actually in chapter 7, if you want to read a little bit about him in the story of World War II. His name's Manuel Serrano. He was from Brooklyn, New York. He was believed to be killed in Tunisia, and he showed up in Italy in like civilian clothes, and they're like, "Who are you?" He says, "Hey, I'm Manuel Serrano. Look, we thought you were dead. You've been gone for months." And he's like, "Yeah, well, I managed to escape in a prison break, and I joined Italian partisans." This guy fought, and he wasn't the only one. There were other U.S. soldiers and British soldiers that broke out of prison camps and that joined the Italian partisan movement. And they would fight, they would capture Nazis, they'd capture fascists, they would hold trials, they would perform executions. In fact, he liberated a town after the Allies had moved through. They found out that the Allies were moving on Rome. So he liberates this town, this is 44, and the town wanted to make him mayor of the town and have him marry one of the women in town. And he's like, I probably better get back in my outfit. So he hung out for a few days, relaxed, and then rejoined his regiment and kept on fighting. So that's kind of like I think those are like the interesting anecdotes of the war, right?
I'll have something with marriage and marriage, but I'm
Yeah.
chill here. Not just leave.
And he another interesting thing too, there were 6 soldiers American soldiers that were killed by fascists, and they were buried by a group of nuns. And when he found out, he said, all right, well, I'm going to have to kill these 6, I'm going to have to find 6 fascists and kill them with my bare hands for these 6 guys. And he did. So that's what the partisans were doing. Do keep in mind that the 5th Army, they had some of the highest casualty reports in the entire war. Mark Wayne Clark's 5th Army won 20% of the Congressional Medals of Honor in World War II. I may have mentioned that last night, so I'm not sure. So the Allied invasion began in the summer of 43 of Sicily. The mainland invasion of Italy began in the fall, September, late summer, early fall. And it really continues all the way up till 45. I guess you could say, well, what about June 4th, 1944? That's the fall of Rome. But the reality of this is the fighting continues on in northern Italy. Most folks that fought once Rome falls, a lot of those folks are going to be moved to other theaters of war. And in fact, this is, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll get to this in a minute. So the Italian campaign really was a brutal affair. Heavy rain, a lot of snow, thick mud, steep mountainous terrain, and Kesselring's Nazi forces are deeply dug in. You see these lines? These are the winter line, the winter line, Hitler line, Gustav line, the Rome line, and then the Gothic line. So these defensive lines and this really steep terrain, look at this, steep terrain throughout. This is going to create major problems for the Allies. And then this is Field Marshal General Albert Kesselring. So the Germans obviously benefited from the defensive position. One of the most frustrating things for soldiers was the constant bombing of the 88s, because once the bomb, you could hear the bomb, you had about 2 seconds to react, and that wasn't enough time to get away. So that really messed with the mental psyche of the soldier. In fact, there's a really great line in chapter 7 of the book where one of the guys says, "For the rest of my life, if I ever saw a mountain, I'd try to find something to hide behind." And that was how difficult the fighting was in Italy. Again, the Gustav line, about 100 miles from Rome. Common phrase used here is "up the bloody boot," and that's the title of chapter 7. And if I ask you about the Italian campaign on, the final, I'm going to include that particular term phrase. The front did not stabilize until January of 1944. A lot of these troops are removed to England to train for D-Day. One group in particular is an elite fighting infantry unit that the United States has now is sort of like, is like first in our hearts. What Army unit do we think about that we can send in to take care of business? What, you're on the right path. Their first, those guys, 101st, 82nd, their first operation is D-Day. I'm looking for another group. The Rangers, the Army Rangers. The Rangers fight here, and then, so the Rangers fight in North Africa, they fight in Italy, and then they go to D-Day. And they take Point Du Hoc. Insane. Like, that type of combat, those guys would have seen in a 2-year period, boggles the mind. So, again, this is what's nuts about Anzio. Anzio is the beachhead to take Rome. This particular battle for Anzio is fought from January to June, right? Just to be able to take Rome, January to June. These guys are pinned in at Anzio. So, again, Allied commander at this period of time is not Eisenhower. Ike is over dealing with, about to launch D-Day. It's Harold Alexander, British commander. Reluctantly, they decide to bomb Monte Cassino behind Anzio. It's this large, massive monastery. What they don't realize is the Nazis are not held up in there. It's actually just a group of monks and trying to think of the help me out here. Who would be the head of a monastery? The name of a person who would be the head of a monastery. They're all monks, but
I feel like it would just be like the head monk.
yeah. What do we call them? An abbot? Is that what they're called? Is it an abbot?
Like a thing.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. It is? Cool. So it's an abbot and like a group of monks. That's all that's in there. They bombed this thing, and that was like one of the regrets of the Allies, that this ancient monastery that there was no need for it to be destroyed. So this is like major air battle, large-scale bombers. The group of bombers, the envoy, was led by the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American bombers. Met a guy that was involved in that, won the Distinguished Flying Cross. He's from Midlothian. I got to pull his name for you guys. He said that, you know Mr. Treisler that gave the presentation at the War Memorial? He and I interviewed this guy, and he said that the bravest envoy that he ever fought with was Tuskegee Airmen, or ever flew with. And they ended up winning a citation for this particular campaign. So from here, the Polish will take Monte Cassino, and the Germans that surrendered, guess who they want to surrender to? The British. They do not want to surrender to the Poles. They're pretty much begging to surrender to the British instead of the Poles, out of fear of what the Poles might do. Again, Kesselring gives up Monte Cassino, but there's also sort of like an adverse effect of Monte Cassino, because the bombing out of Monte Cassino creates so much rubble that it's an even bigger obstacle for the Allies to move past. This is where they fall back to the Gothic line. The Nazis will hold this until September of 1944. Rome will fall on June 4th, 1944. Okay, Mark Wayne Clark, he's very sort of, he's kind of like a Patton in a way. He's very sort of pompous. He wants to be recognized, and he wants to march into Rome. Rome is of sort of symbolic value. Why? Why is Rome symbolically important?
Because it's kind of where culture originated.
Yes, and also Rome is the first what to fall? Yes, it's the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies. So Mark Wayne Clark wants to be a part of that PR scenario, right? I'm going to march into Rome, huzzah. They march into Rome, and the Romans, it's like it was dead. People thought that everybody was gone because the Roman people didn't know what was going to happen at the hands of the liberators until they figured out they came to liberate, and then suddenly everybody rolls out in the streets and we start breaking up the casks of wine, and everybody has a good time throwing flowers at their feet. Oh, speaking of wine, this is also a pretty wild story. So the Anzio battle, that fighting that occurred from January to June, there were massive barrels of wine buried all along Anzio. So the soldiers at night and in the early mornings would go through and mine sweep for these barrels because they were wrapped in copper bands, and they picked these wine barrels up. And a couple of soldiers wrote that was like the only saving grace of Anzio, is that they found all this wine that they rationed out during that months-long campaign. So at the end of the campaign, Allied casualties were staggering. Destruction was tragic. The invasion, really, this would be, and if y'all want to look at a significant Allied advantage here, the invasion held down 20 German divisions. Where are those German divisions sucked from? Potential D-Day invasion and the Soviet Union, right? Operation Barbarossa. They pulled they pulled soldiers from those areas to reinforce Kessel. Nearly 700,000 casualties in this campaign. Roughly 400,000 German, about 300,000 Allied, just under 200,000 Americans. That doesn't even count the civilian casualties in this campaign. Nor horses and mules, which is important as well to think about. So here we have the Italian campaign laid out from Palermo all the way to Rome. And this is American soldiers marching through the rugged terrain of the Bloody Boot. This is the amphibious assault at Anzio. To this point, like Sicily and Anzio, those have been the two largest amphibious assaults up to that point. But you can understand why Rome, by all that, was eclipsed, because on June 6, 1944, D-Day will occur. Here we have soldiers landing in Italy. We also have the landing craft over there on the right. That's what Monte Cassino looked like before the bombing. That's what Monte Cassino looked like afterward. And this right here is the Gothic line. That's the last line of defense set up by Kesselring from August to September of 1944. And here's Mark Wayne Clark entering Rome, June 4th, 1944. He will ultimately take command of Harold Alexander's forces, or Allied forces. You guys have any questions? All right, awesome.